will be a problem. I'll try to.
Nah, we're good. Okay.
Now you can erase some of it, right?
I can edit.
Okay.
Okay, we're here today interviewing Lew Schwartz, a longtime Monmouth Junction resident. It's January 21st, 2016. Here in attendance is Randy Marsola, South Brunswick Township librarian and interviewer. Okay, we'll start with home life. Where and when were you born?
I was born in 1935, April 9th. I was actually born in the Bronx, New York, but I didn't spend any time there. My mother had prenatal care, and then they came here at a very early age to get away from city life. And I lived in a great little town. It's still there, Englishtown. It had a population of 800 people, and It was strictly small town. It was more like a Midwest population. And the reason I came to South Brunswick, I came here by marriage. I was dating my wife in high school, and I fell for her, and I'm still very much in love with her. She's a great person. And then at high school, Jamesburg High School, which is no longer in existence, but it was a receiving school from about 4 or 5 different areas, including Englishtown and South Brunswick. And I met her at school, and our first date, believe it or not, was on a hayride. In those days, we had what we called hayrides, and it was on the back of a wagon, and we all laid in the hay that was on the wagon and sang songs, etc., etc., etc. And that's how I came to South Brunswick. At that time, I was working part-time, but I was going to graduate school for social work at Goodall Rutgers. And my wife helped me through because she was working steady as a teacher. So that's how I really came to South Brunswick. But I knew a lot of people because South Brunswick was a sending school to Jamesburg High School.
Okay.
So that's really how it all started.
Well, describe your family when you were growing up.
When I was growing up in Englishtown, I'm of a Jewish background, and they originally came from Brooklyn. And my father was a great guy. He was in the radio, TV repair business. But when we started, when he came here in the late 20s, what it was, he had a shop. His repair shop was in the bedroom of our house. And my brother and I doubled up, and they had their own bedroom, of course. And he had his shop with all his repair and tools in this bedroom. And when people brought in their radios for repair, no TV then, they would come up the stairs, and often it was during the Depression, and often they wouldn't pay in cash, but it was in kind. I remember farmers bringing up potatoes because it was during the Depression. And then I went to school in Englishtown. There were 8 grades, and made a lot of friends then. In those days, everybody knew everyone else, and they'd help everyone else. But the trouble is they also knew everyone else's business. So there were some disadvantages also.
No secrets, right?
Yeah, but I very much miss Englishtown, since I now have Parkinson's and don't drive. Englishtown had maybe 5 or 6 stores, and I used to hang out in the local luncheonette with the boys in school and high school, and we used to call ourselves, and they still, drugstore cowboys. And that was anyone, a young person that hung out. And in those days, we also had a soda fountains in all the drugstores. So we'd also hang out there. So that I was also, as a youngster, until when I got into high school, I was 5 years in the local rescue squad. It's all volunteer here and there. And it was a very good experience. I learned a lot about people. And being in a small town, we had one doctor, Dr. Woodruff, and he always made house calls, and the fee was $3, okay, and he carried his own bag of pills. And he used to say to us, what color pill do you want that day? But we never paid him because, once again, it was a barter system. My dad fixed his radio, and then he fixed us. Sometimes he fixed us, but it was a swap-off. And that's, my dad was the founder of the rescue squad, one of 7 charter members. He was also fire chief. So that gave us some status as a family in the community.
And this is the rescue squad
This
in
is a
Englishtown.
rescue squad in Englishtown.
In Englishtown, right.
Right now we have a very well organized paramedics and EMT. And when I rode, all I had was a Red Cross card. We used to call it swoop and scoop, or scoop and swoop. But that's a lot more to tell about a early life.
Now your family and your relatives, they were born here, or were they from somewhere else?
No, my parents were born in Brooklyn.
But
Right.
so they were born in America. So English was
They were first generation, right?
and English was the language that you spoke growing up.
Yeah. Well, my folks spoke a little Yiddish.
Some Yiddish in there.
And I
Okay.
learned mostly the dirty words. Okay, and I also learned the words when I was being scolded. Okay, and then words like yenta, and words that are very common, even Christians know today. I went to a synagogue in town, Orthodox,
Mhm.
but I didn't get involved because when they had services on a Saturday, they lasted 4 hours. And you talk about male chauvinists, the women had to sit upstairs, okay, in the balcony, and they were unequal and separate. Not equal, but unequal. And as a result, I haven't become that close. I'm a strong believer in religion, but I haven't become that close in relation to former religion.
Right, right.
So that's the story of early Lew.
Now, did you have any stories? Did your parents tell you any stories from the old country?
From the old country,
Yeah, or was that too far removed? That was too long.
far removed. My grandmother, who was born in Poland,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and another one who was born in, I believe, Germany, okay, Grandma Sipkin, she had some stories to tell. And she came here at a young age also, but often told me about the hardships there and how when you came to, as she called it, America, through Ellis Island, you worked. There was no such thing as welfare. If you did get any help, it was from a neighbor or it was from a church or synagogue. But in those days, we didn't have any kind of Social Security. I came into it, but they had a very, very hard life.
They used to call it relief back then.
I
I
would
think.
call it relief when it
Yeah.
finally came on.
Now,
Yeah.
describe the household you grew up in. I mean, what was it like, the physical house? I mean, was there plumbing? Was there electricity, telephones? Name
Yeah.
some of the amenities you did or didn't have.
It was a little different from my wife's wife, Singler, in South Brunswick, because she was in a very primitive old farmhouse. Our house was on what they call then Main Street, and we had water in an old sink, but we didn't have any real heat, no central heat. It was a boiler downstairs with a regulator up on the first floor, and we burned coal. And in those days, everybody had a coal bin in the cellar. It was made out of shelving, and it was about, I would say 8 feet by 10 feet. And what it did, you had your coal delivery in the summer, and I think coal then was about $6 a ton. And that was the main way of heating. And there was a big opening in the floor with a grate so you didn't fall in the living room. And there was no heat on the second floor because there were no radiators or vents. And my dad cut a hole in the floor, very small, so that the heat would rise up. But there was no heat in the bathroom. When we took a bath, no such thing as a shower, my mom would come up from the first floor to the second floor, and she'd have a big pot of hot water. And you had to back off in the tub, and she'd pour the hot water into the tub. The only time you really had water, because you had to light a little belly stove in the basement out of wood and coal, was on a Saturday, because it was a big deal and work to light the stove in the basement that would heat the water. So during the week we took what they call sponge baths. They had a basin and you had a sponge, and what you would do, you'd have to wash yourself down with borax soap and water, and you would wash your body down from what they call a basin wash. So that it was quite primitive. We also outside had an old pump, a hand pump, and we had a garage that was separate, and that's unheated, and that's where my father used to install radios in cars. In those days, there were no radios from the factory in cars. There was no such thing as air conditioning. So our job, and I used to help him, was to put radios in the car. And when you sold your car and bought another car, you took your old radio out and you installed it into the car that you had now bought. The dials, the tuning dials, were separate, and there were no push buttons on them, and you got 5 stations, all from New York, and there was a lot of static on the stations.
And these are all AM stations, of course.
And these were all AM. There was no such thing as FM in those days. But it was a hard way of life, but we knew it, and that was the only way we knew. Now, food was, of course, in those days, we considered expensive, but it really wasn't compared to today. And in those days, we ate a lot of bologna. We were also full of bologna as a result. But bologna was one of the cheapest. And we would buy hamburger. And if I remember, hamburger meat was like about 15 cents a pound in those days. And there was no supermarkets. We went to the local grocery, Zakowitz's. This is in Englishtown now. And we went to Zakowitz. Everybody that was working there, the clerks would wear white aprons. And what it was, they had a little meat market within, and there was no frozen food. I remember the first frozen food was a little case, the size of an ice cream cake case, and it was the only one was made by Bird's Eye. And when it first came out, the only thing you could buy, Randy, were Bird's Eye peas in frozen. And there was no such thing as credit cards, fortunately. And what you did when you went in, you either paid cash. If you didn't have it, you didn't buy. Or they had a system, if they knew you, they would put your purchase on a little white slip. And then there was a little clothesline toward the back, and they would hang your O slip, IOU, on a clothespin on this line. And when you came in at the end of the week, if you had the money or part of it, then they would pull the little paper, and that's what you would pay. In addition, there were no cash registers. Okay, they used paper bags, brown paper bags, and they would figure up each item on the paper bag. But in those days, people could add. They didn't have computers, but they would add it up, and everyone was friendly. You'd go in to buy a loaf of bread, and it would take about 10 minutes because Charlie, the clerk, would be talking to somebody else about the weather. So nobody got upset because that's the way it was.
So you had mentioned before about the frozen food. So you had an ice box in your house. You didn't freeze your food. So you didn't, did you have a refrigerator and a freezer, or just an ice box?
A good question. When we first started there in 1938 or 39, we had an ice box, a typical, and we had a little sign. I think it had an eye on it. It was about, maybe 5 by 5. And when you needed ice every 2 or 3 days, you would put the sign in your window. And when the iceman came around, not a nice woman in those days, there was a lot of chauvinism, still is, but when the iceman would come around, he knew you would need it because you had your little indicator, your little cardboard eye in the window. And he would come in with his ice pick.
To let him know.
And then we would, everybody had an ice pick to chop it up. But a trick we used to use, we used to wrap, to make it look longer, the ice in newspaper to cover it up, because that way it didn't melt as quick.
So it would insulate a little bit.
Right. But there were no freezers. But, well, there was a little one, but I guess it wasn't a freezer. And that's why I don't think frozen food really was popular or came out in those days, because there was no place to store it.
No place to put it. And you had electric lights in your house.
In those days, we didn't call it the electric bill. We called it the electric light bill, because one of the few things that ran on electric, we had electric. But of course, my dad was very handy. As a sideline, he would wire houses in those days. But we would call it the electric bulb bill, because about the most things you ran were bulbs. That was your bill used to be about $3-4 a month. But in those days, we didn't have washers. Okay, they came along later. My mother used to do her wash on a scrub board. And boy, that was tough on her knuckles. tough on her knuckles.
Uh-huh.
And then we had no dryers, of course. Everybody had a clothesline with pulleys, and what you would do is hang your clothes with clothespins on the line to dry. One of the advantages there is nothing like clothes dried outside in the sun. Far better than having them in our new electric dryers.
They smell nice.
They smell great. In addition, my neighbor was very handy, a carpenter. When I was about 3 or 4 years old, he made a little bucket, and the line was on pulleys, okay, and they went out far, and there was a pulley on the other end, and he put us in the bucket, and that became our little roller coaster, except it went straight, and that was a big deal. It was the only one in the neighborhood.
Now, did you
neighbor
have
Gus Ekdahl? He worked for the old WPA or PWA during the Depression. He had an old Model A Ford with a rumble seat, and he used to take us to the movies. Freehold for the movies were 10 cents then for a double header, a double feature, and we used to ride in his old Model A in the rumble seat.